The South fought believing that they could preserve civilization, that their way of living was better than anyone else's, even though, as your book says, the only difference between the South and other civilizations was the South was a slave society and the rest of the world was not at the time, but the South looked on their culture as being the best in the world. They also had an overdependence on cotton, believing that the rest of the world could not do without their cotton, and unknown to them, Great Britain decided, hey, we found that cotton will grow in Morocco and cotton will grow in India, and Great Britain had already conquered India. So they started buying their cotton from other places besides the South. And this wound up hurting the South. Now, the initial battles, there were two big fronts. The Western Front, which included the states of Tennessee and Georgia, and eventually South Carolina and North Carolina. There was a fighting on the west, and then there was the fighting between Richmond and Washington. There were battles, well, the first big battle was the Battle of Bull Run. There wound up being two battles fought at Bull Run, both of them Confederate victories. There was also a big battle of 7 days, also a Confederate victory. One of the problems the Union had was their hero, a man they thought would win for them, named George McClellan. George McClellan was a little man, and they compared him to Napoleon, who also had been a little man. George McClellan was highly popular with his troops. I must mention him, though, because he was so important. McClellan said that Lincoln was an idiot. Yeah, and he said that Lincoln's cabinet were a flock of geese, and geese were known for their lack of intelligence. So basically he was running down both Lincoln and his cabinet. Today's historians praise Lincoln highly, and McClellan is looked on as being an idiot. Oh, come, well, there's a poem that we used to recite as kids, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, what you say is what you are." All right, here's where McClellan made a dunce of himself. The Confederates realized they were being counted. So the Confederate soldiers marched single file in front of an opening where they knew they were being counted. Then once they'd marched, they'd regroup themselves, and get out of sight and regroup, and march again. Then they'd regroup and march again, and every Confederate soldier was counted 3 times. So they reported back to McClellan that the Confederate Army was 3 times bigger than it actually was. McClellan later realized he'd been completely duped, but by that time it was too late. If that weren't enough, the Confederates chopped down trees, smoothed out the trees, and pointed the trees toward McClellan's men, and McClellan counted them as cannon. And McClellan believed that the Confederates had a lot more cannon than he had. And if you visit some of these fields today, you'll still see some trees that have been chopped down. Might not be the same trees, but with the trees pointing in the direction of the Union Army. And again, McClellan believed that the Confederates had several times more heavy artillery than they actually had. Today we know, McClellan complained to Lincoln, "My army is outnumbered, my men are out-equipped, my men are outgunned." Today he's looked like a complete idiot. The facts are his army was bigger than the Confederate Army and much, much better equipped than the Confederate Army. They had a lot more weapons better weapons than did the Confederacy. If only McClellan would have moved, the war might have ended in short order. Instead, McClellan remained still for months, did not move. When he finally did move, it was too late. The Confederates were better equipped. The Confederacy was destined to win battle after battle. 2 battles at Bull Run, 2 battles, then battles at Fredericksburg, that was a Confederate victory. 7 days, that was a Confederate victory. However, now folk, there was one battle that McClellan fought that was not a Confederate victory. All right, I'm going to do a little demonstration here. It's believed that some Confederate officer one day pulled out a cigarette, walked on. Sometime later, a Union private walked by, saw this piece of paper lying on the ground, picked it up. Oh, I had better take this to my captain. He knew it was the Confederate battle plan. He took it to his captain. The captain took it straight to General McClellan. The paper told McClellan that the Confederates were planning to go and take Maryland. And for the one and only time in his life, McClellan actually got up and moved. This was something Lee had not been counting on and something Lee did not expect, and Lee did not find out till years later. McClellan had his entire plan in his pocket. General Lee picked out 55,000 troops, best equipped troops he had, and they were singing My Maryland, My Maryland. If you know anything about the state of Maryland, that's due to the same tune as Oh Christmas Tree, My Maryland, My Maryland. And some of you might have heard that song maybe in your lifetime. Anyway, they met at the Battle of Antietam. Now, folks, this was one of two times that the Confederacy stepped out of bounds, and in both times were disastrous. The Confederacy should say, anyway, they met at Antietam. McClellan behaved like he typically behaved. He wrote to his wife, "Oh, my men are suffering terribly. This is war. This battle is going badly for us." What McClellan did not know was how much damage he was inflicting on the Confederate Army. His men greatly outnumbered the Confederacy. Anyway, after 2 days or so of fighting, which neither side could claim victory, McClellan was about to retreat, but he didn't. Instead, he got up. The Confederates did not offer to fight. They bedded down for the night again and woke up the next morning. The Confederate Army had gone, went back to Maryland. So this was the only victory that McClellan could claim. Abraham Lincoln was upset because, well, why didn't you pursue him? What Lincoln did not realize was that in those days, victorious generals never pursued their defeated foe, owing to the fact that even a victorious army would be so badly mauled that they could never organize, and you'd see a lot of poor straggling men who had just woken up after being hit hard in the head and knocked out, woke up and went, where's my outfit? And they started asking around, where's Captain thus and such, where's the 24th Infantry, and sometimes nobody would see them. Eventually, these men would be found or find their unit, but you'd have a whole lot of lost men who had no idea where their other buddies were or where their outfit was. You'd have a whole lot of wounded men, and even the officers would look around, and half the men, in some case more than half the men were missing, and some of them would eventually straggle in, but I mean, in the confusion of battle, these men would get busy fighting and or sometimes get badly wounded and knocked out and wake up and not know where they were at or where their buddies were. And needless to say, victorious armies could not pursue defeated foes, but Lincoln had a hard time understanding that. Throughout the war, he didn't. But anyway, Antietam was one victory for the Union, the only victory McClellan had. Eventually, Lincoln replaced McClellan for good. After Antietam, the last great victory for the Confederacy was at Chancellorsville. Here was the problem at Chancellorsville. Stonewall Jackson himself got killed at the Battle of Chancellorsville. In Jackson's case, I mean, you might say he asked for it. Jackson, his men thought he was in the rear like a general should have been. Instead, he was out in the front in the dark, in front of his men, looking for the enemy who had long since been. He was determined, we're going to finish them off. No, his men were tired. He should have had them rest, and he should have been resting himself. Instead, he made a determined effort, and all he did was get himself shot. And the instant he was shot, he knew he was shot by his own men. Something else about the Battle of Chancellorsville that the Confederate people started noticing, have noticed since. The Battle of Chancellorsville cost the Confederacy more men than the Confederacy could afford to lose. In other words, Robert E. Lee was honored for a long time, several generations, but as time has gone on, the people of the South have started to realize that, hey, Lee was the reason we lost the war. The South could not afford Lee. Lee was fighting the way a general would when he had an equal number of men, and the fact is, all right, typical battle in the Civil War. Typical battle, the Union Army might lose 26,000 men, the Confederate Army 22,000. All right, but folks, you don't win by killing the most men, you win when you get the enemy to run. Typical battle. When the battle was over, the Union Army had retreated, lost quite a bit more men than the Confederacy, but here was the catch-22. The Confederacy lost a higher percentage than the Union did, but here's the real catcher. The Union could replace its men. Eventually, the Confederacy could not. And this was particularly true at Chancellorsville, where the percentage of men that the Confederacy lost was much, much higher. Now, the way that the Confederacy would win was by outmaneuvering. Stonewall Jackson was great at flanking the enemy. Basically, the idea was you had to keep the enemy in the front of you. But if the enemy got around your flank and started hitting you from the side or from behind, it would create panic among the troops, and the troops were likely to scatter. But the troops would fight as long as they could see that the enemy's in front of us. When the enemy got around their flank, oh boy, we've got to get out of here. Hey, fuck this. That's the way Jackson won fight after fight after fight. By outmaneuvering, outflanking, moving fast, hitting the enemy before they realized he was anywhere near. In fact, one time the Union was put up a balloon to watch the Confederate movements, but Jackson figured out that, hey, I can hide my men under a cloud, so Jackson marched his men under a cloud and got to the Union where the men in the balloon could not see where Jackson and his men were, and he struck them with when he'd strike oftentimes when the men were, when the enemy was not even expecting. Now, of course, it has been said that Jackson only opposed the weakest and worst of the Union generals. To some extent, that's true. For instance, the Union General Thomas was never surprised. And it had been said that Thomas would never have been fooled by any of Jackson's antics. That might have been true, but Jackson and Thomas never met. What Jackson could have done against Sherman, again, we don't know. Well, the biggest mistake the Confederacy made, and folk, I'm moving along quickly, but it was in Lee decided, hey, they're tearing up our territory, they're destroying our crops. Let's go and put the fighting in their territory. So he went to southern Pennsylvania. But the battle went badly for him. All right. Now, I lived in Waynesboro one time, which was, I told you about how Waynesboro was named after Anthony Wayne. Lee's army went into Waynesboro, and then they took what they called Gettysburg Road, and they turned right there at the Gettysburg Road, and they were into Gettysburg. Now, the battle was not planned to be at Gettysburg. In fact, General Meade had gotten wind that the Confederacy had marched through Maryland, were in Pennsylvania, so the Union General, General Meade, went to Pennsylvania himself. But, again, if any of you know anything about that territory, it's very mountainous. Many mountains, huge mountains. And neither army knew where the other one was, and neither army could see very far. And even if you got to the top of the mountain, couldn't they get to the top of the mountain and look below? Because no, the mountains have rounded tops, and you can't see very much. The fact is, Meade did not know where Lee was, and Lee did not know where Meade was. The two sides bumped into each other accidentally. The Confederates fired even though Lee had said, don't fire, we'll give our positions away, we don't want to know who we are. The Confederate soldiers fired anyway. Now the Union soldiers were not told that they shouldn't fire, so the Union soldiers did nothing wrong, but the Union soldiers fired, the Confederate soldiers fired back, and then that let everybody know where everybody was, so Union and Confederate alike started to converge pell-mell at Gettysburg. When I was a child, my father took me there. I was 11 years old, and I still remember the place. Battlefield, several sites. But the big turning point at Gettysburg was a place called Cemetery Ridge. The Union Army had been driven up the ridge. But folk, if you know anything about the fighting, once you're up higher than the enemy, that means, number one, you can see farther, you can shoot farther, and a bullet going downhill will hit harder than a bullet going uphill. Well, Lee had decided, my army is invincible, they can do anything. That's always a bad place to be, folk. Anyway, Lee had his men fire their artillery up Cemetery Ridge, hoping to soften the place, but his artillery shot high. I mean, these Confederates, not one Confederate knew anything at all about the terrain at Gettysburg. In the meantime, in Meade's army, there were several people from around that area, and they knew all the places around Gettysburg. They played war games there as a child, no doubt, or whatever young boys did in those days. But Meade's men knew the territory, Lee's men did not, and there were no good maps available in those days compared to what there are today. Anyway, Lee had his men shoot their cannon, and that everything missed. Well, Lee with his men could see that the cannon fire had missed and had done no significant damage to the Union Army. It had some non-combatants on the opposite side of the ridge, but otherwise had done no significant damage to the Union Army. Lee had to make a decision. Should he quit the fighting here, or should he march up the hill? Under protest from all his generals, he ordered his men to march up the hill at Cemetery Ridge. From that date, there's been movies made about that march. There have been books written about it. There have been historians who have gone to the place and they've counted the steps, they've measured the distance, they've counted how long it would have taken them in. Some of the Confederate troops got to the top of Cemetery Ridge, a few. But for the most part, the Confederates eventually, they slowed down, they stopped, they wavered a bit, then they backed up a bit, then they turned around and started walking, then they turned around and started running pell-mell from the battlefield. Unknown to Lee at the time, the whole Southern cause was lost. Unknown to Lee, because even though there were telegraphs, they didn't cover everything, Lee retreated from Gettysburg on July 4th, 1863. The date is familiar to you. He did not know that Vicksburg had fallen to Grant. That Vicksburg was important because Vicksburg meant that the Union Army now controlled a lot of the Mississippi River. So that was a miserable time for the Confederacy. Gettysburg was lost and it was raining heavily as Lee left Gettysburg, raining really hard. Lincoln was to go back to that battlefield some months later in November and give what we call the Gettysburg Address. That's another incident. Your book doesn't mention it. But anyway, Gettysburg represented a turning point. Lee never took the offensive. Well, Meade went to Gettysburg, but somehow he never could mount a major offensive. So Lincoln did not demote or replace Lee. Instead, Lincoln called on General Grant and said, Mr. Grant, I want you to take command of the entire army. When he did, General Meade offered to resign, but Grant said, I thought highly of you after Gettysburg. I think even more highly of you now. Stay on. So Meade remained head of the Army of the Potomac, but Grant ranked one rank above him. So Grant took command, took charge. Grant was in the West. Now, during the time that Grant was in the West, he won victory after victory, but he had a few problems. Number one, unlike other generals, he dressed like a slouch. He looked like a slouch. He didn't take a bath often enough. He also, from time to time, would start drinking. His men, when they were playing in the press, would complain Grant is drinking again. Then Grant would try to control his drinking. Then he'd start up again because, the war put pressures on him. Finally, a bunch of men got together and went to Mr. Lincoln and said, we've got to replace him. He's a slouch. He doesn't command attention. But see, when Grant, he never issued an order. He'd ask the men, do you want to do such and such? Will you do this for me? And he got more than he needed every time. Now, for instance, one time, he wanted to cross the Mississippi River. But he needed someone to go ahead first and prepare the way so that the other men would be safe. To protect the other men who would be exposed as they crossed the river. That was an extremely dangerous job, though, to be the first leaders, the men to go across the Mississippi. So rather than make the men do it, he called volunteers. I need some men to volunteer to be the pre-party, the first party, to cross the Mississippi. He got so many volunteers, he had to turn some of them away. But again, this is the way he led. He was very introverted. But anyway, they made off. They said, he drinks, he's a slouch. Lincoln thought it over a moment, then he told the men, I cannot spare this man, he fights. I have learned that wherever Grant is, things move. Well, Grant took over the Army in February 1864, took over the Army of the Potomac, and he headed for Richmond, unlike McClellan and the others, and he didn't quit. He engaged Lee at Wilderness, engaged Lee at Cold Harbor and Spotsylvania. 3 big battles of which Grant could not really claim a victory, but nevertheless he didn't retreat, he didn't run. He'd fight, he'd lose a bunch of men. At one time, Grant made a charge on Confederacy. In 1 hour, the Confederates lost 700 men. Grant lost 7,000 men in that same hour. Grant later admitted that the charge had been a mistake, charging right into Confederate bullets. But nevertheless, again, keep in mind, the Union could afford those kind of mistakes. The Confederacy couldn't. Grant kept going, even after losing a lot of men. Again, keep in mind, every time Grant lost a man, he could replace him. Other men kept pouring in. About this time, too, Abraham Lincoln made the war a slave war. Here's why he was forced into it. He did not intend to. But Great Britain, which had Canada, Great Britain sent an army to Canada. Everyone knew they were going to fight for the Confederacy. France took over Mexico. France sent an army in Mexico. Now later the Mexicans drove the French out, and with the help from the United States persuaded the French to leave. But France had an army in Mexico. Great Britain had an army in Canada. The United States was running a risk of having to fight both the Confederacy and Great Britain and France. But about that time, Russia, who had freed their serfs, Russia moved an army, a navy to California, and they told Britain and France, we will fight on the side of the North. Well, Lincoln did not want this war to expand into Europe. Now here is the problem that Europeans had. They believed that if the United States remained together, the United States would someday interfere in Europe's wars. Folks, that's exactly what eventually happened. And I wanted to tell you, what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War when we had to fight Germany in World War I? It is likely the South would have fought on the side of Germany. And I hate to think what could have happened. Hate it really badly. But the Germans had ambitions to conquer the world. And I especially hate to think what would have happened if Hitler would have won World War II. But anyway, all right, Canada has an army. Great Britain has an army in Canada. The French are in Mexico. To get both countries off his back, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This said that every state that was at war with a union, that all the slaves there were to be freed. Lincoln had no power to enforce it. But here's what it did for him. Great Britain and France had both outlawed slavery 2 generations before, in the late 1700s. And both Great Britain and France sent ambassadors to President Davis in Richmond and said, sir, we're sorry to inform we cannot fight for you because you're a slave state. Lincoln made it into a slave war, and the people of France and Great Britain were not going to fight to support slavery. In addition, Russia, which was looked on as being a big nation at the time, agreed to Britain or France wanted to tangle with Russia. So basically, Lincoln, in a smart move, got Great Britain and got France off his back. And if that weren't enough, he made it into a slave war, which meant he got more volunteers for his army. The Union troops all knew they were fighting to end slavery, and the South became aware that, hey, if we lose this war, slavery over. Well, Lincoln at this time began pushing for the adoption of the 13th Amendment. Now, if you know anything about the Constitution can be amended by 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the Senate. Here's how he got it through the House and Senate. 11 Confederate states were not there in Congress at the time. The states that were left were anti-slavery. So he got through the House, and then he had to try to get it through 3/4 of the states. That took some time, but he eventually got it through again because the state of Georgia did not vote on did not vote. Neither did the state of South Carolina. All these 11 states that left the Union, they didn't get to vote. So the 13th Amendment was passed, and it applied to all states. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. What this meant for the Southerners was, if they ever were conquered and forced to rejoin the Union, they'd have to end slavery. Well, the Confederacy sent an ambassador, including the Vice President, who was the former governor of Georgia, Mr. Stevens, I believe. They sent an ambassador to try to convince Lincoln that we have to have slavery in the South. You don't understand it, but we can't do without it. Lincoln did not listen. The war became a slave war at that point. Well, after Grant took over, Grant finally got to a town called Petersburg. I took my family to Petersburg about 4.5 years ago in the summer of 2014. Took them there, and the Battle of Petersburg does not get recognition, but your book mentions it. It's very, very important. All of the railroads going into Richmond went through Petersburg. If Petersburg fell, the Confederacy would be lost. The Confederates resisted valiantly. For once, the Union Army resorted to trench warfare, and this helped keep down casualties a little bit. But the Union Army resorted to fighting from trenches and foxholes, something they had not done before. The siege of Petersburg lasted several months. It ended when Lee decided to abandon Petersburg and go and take care of General Sherman. Now, General Sherman. Sherman was left in charge of the Western Front. Well, Sherman began to march from Tennessee, marched from Chattanooga, and marched into Georgia. He engaged at Kennesaw Mountain, but that was a mistake. You know, if any of you go to the Kennesaw battlefield, Sherman tried to get his men to climb the mountain. This was a mistake because, again, the Confederates high. So the Kennesaw was a Confederate victory, but it did not slow Sherman down. Sherman then went on to march toward Atlanta. Sherman crossed the Chattahoochee River, went to Atlanta, and burned Atlanta to the ground. Now, Sherman fought dirty. General Sherman believed that you fight hard against a man. Once you defeat him, then you treat him nicely. Sherman did feel a bit badly about burning that beautiful city of Atlanta to the ground, but he said, I know these people, that they're going to build an even more beautiful city in the place of the one I'm burning down. And yes, he was right. The people of Atlanta did build a more beautiful city. Then Sherman marched from Atlanta to the capital, Milledgeville. He took Milledgeville. Again, the Confederates did not have, they tried to stop him, but they couldn't. He took Milledgeville, and a bunch of his soldiers went into the Capitol building, and they sat down and held a mock legislative session where they voted unanimously to bring Georgia back into the Union. It was not an official vote, and the Georgians did not respect it. Now, my wife argues with this, but I had a teacher who said that Georgia did not receive much help from the other states, and here was the problem with the Confederacy because Georgia had not helped the other states. Again, if you know better, you're welcome to say so, but apparently Georgia did not receive a lot of aid. Anyway, Sherman then marched through Georgia and marched from Milledgeville, which is part of near Macon, marched from Milledgeville to Savannah, and he burned everything a mile wide in his path. He blocked all the roads, throwing stones or log, whatever, heavy logs, on the roads. The rails, he took up all the rails, burnt the middle of the rails, and then bent the rails into pretzels. And then if you ever know anything about metallurgy, once you've bent a railroad into a shape like a pretzel, you can never unbend it. You have to recast it from scratch and melt it down and start all over, but you cannot straighten it out. It would be too weak. So he bent all the rails on the railroads, basically cut the Confederacy in two, got all the way to Savannah, Georgia, and he took Savannah, went to Fort Pulaski, and the Fort Pulaski had fallen into Union hands at the beginning of the war. Spent a few days at Fort Pulaski, then he marched into South Carolina, said the state that started this war were destroyed. He started burning up South Carolina also. He actually got as far as North Carolina by the time the war ended. But Lee got the idea that, hey, I can't defeat Grant, but maybe if I can sneak away from Grant, I can get my army to combine with the army that's already fighting Sherman, and we'll defeat Sherman first, then our combined armies will take on Grant, and maybe I can defeat Grant. The best plan to come up with, the thing about it was it didn't work. Grant had, for this time, too many men. His troops were all fired up and spirited up. Lee's army was deserting in droves. Now, I mentioned that Grant had a few problems. Grant was suffering from terrible headaches. His muscle ached. He ached all over. He couldn't sleep. He was trying hard to keep from drinking. He sent a letter to General Lee, "Are you ready to surrender?" These men would communicate by means of a man on a horse carrying a white flag. And the troops on both sides said, when you see this man on a horse, don't shoot at him. So the generals would communicate with each other. So anyway, Grant sent Lee a letter. Are you ready to surrender? Lee met with his officer and discussed it. Some of them wanted to keep on fighting, but Lee knew it would be more killing. All right. So Lee made a decision. He came to it himself. I'll get to the decision in a moment. In the meantime, Grant was suffering from terrible headache, but one day, one morning, all of Grant's headaches left. All of his muscle aches left. All of his pains just went away. And it wasn't the plaster he was putting on his head to. It wasn't any alcohol he was drinking. He got this letter from General Lee. I'm willing to talk surrender. Meet me at Appomattox Courthouse. All of his pains disappeared in a snap. They had been caused by pressure anyway. He replied through the messenger, I'll meet you at Appomattox Courthouse on such and such a day. So Grant and his entourage went to Appomattox. The story of Appomattox has been told many a time over. Lee dressed in Southern regalia, in the uniform of a full general, everything neatly pressed. Grant dressed like a private, but worse than that, he dressed like a slouch. The two men met, and they had met each other during the Civil War, and during the Mexican War, and they discussed their Mexican War days. The place was, by the way, Appomattox. Finally, Lee said, well, let's get on to the business at hand. So they discussed the business at hand. Lee said to Grant, now my men, when they go home, they'll need to start plowing the gardens. They haven't plowed. I need your horses. Grant said, all right, all the men can keep your horses. Well, what about their swords and sidearms? Grant said, all your men keep your swords. The only thing Grant asked was that Lee turn over his heavy artillery, which Lee expected anyway. But the men were allowed to keep their swords. They were allowed to keep their sidearms. And then they discussed, well, some other issue. What about the prisoners? They both sides agreed, we'll each give you each of our prisoners. So the Union prisoners were all freed. The Confederate prisoners were all freed, etc., etc. Then the two men stepped outside, and the Union Army realized that the war was over, and they started cheering. Grant raised his hand and said, no, that this man is an honorable man. He's fought hard. He's fought well for what he believes. And let's not taunt him. Let's show respect. So the Union Army got quiet. The guns were silent on both sides. The Confederate soldiers went home. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis, when he realized that his city of Richmond was now in Union hands, and Abraham Lincoln actually got in a cart and rode to Richmond to symbolize that Richmond was now in Union hands, Jefferson Davis fled, going to go to Alabama to resume the war, but on his way, he realized that some Union men were after him. He dressed like a woman, supposedly, the story goes, to try to avoid capture, but the Union recognized him. They captured him. He was captured. For all practical purposes, the Confederacy was lost. All right. The war was over. This was Lincoln at its top. The only thing one thing that went pretty badly wrong at the time. Lincoln decided, whew, that's over with. He decided it was time for him to go celebrate. So he went to Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. and watched a play. He saw John Wilkes Booth, and he'd been an admirer of Booth. Booth was the second most famous actor in the country. His brother, Edwin Booth, was the most famous, but Booth was slightly less famous, perhaps. He said, I'd like to meet that man. Unknown to him, Booth had been plotting his assassination. Booth finally got his right moment, got a derringer out. We have a photo of Booth with a derringer aimed at the back of the president's head, the president being unaware he was there. Booth fired his derringer into the back of Lincoln's head. Then Booth jumped to the stage, on the balcony where Lincoln was, but in the meantime Booth twisted his leg and broke his leg, but he yelled out in Latin, sic temper tyrannus, in other words, so to all tyrants, or thus to all tyrants. Ran off. The next day Booth was shot. Now, I'm going to mention this now, then I'll quit. There are a lot of parallels between Lincoln and Kennedy's assassinations. Lincoln was elected in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Their assassins, John Wilkes Booth Lee Harvey Oswald. Their assassins always go by 3 names. The letters in the names, Lee Harvey Oswald, equal the same number of letters as in John Wilkes Booth. Both men were shot in the back of the head. Both men were shot on Friday. Lincoln was shot at Ford Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln that was built by Ford. Now, it was once said that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, but we've searched and no, he didn't. But Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. And Mrs. Lincoln advised Mr. Kennedy don't go to Washington. Don't go to Dallas. He did. Both men had vice presidents named Johnson, who took over when they were killed. Both men died on a Friday. And both men dealt with the issue of civil rights in their time. The issue was still unresolved by the time of Kennedy. Several interesting parallels between the 2 men and their lives and their death. Oh yeah, Lee Harvey Oswald and John Wilkes Booth were both born 100 years apart. The years they were born were 100 years apart. The same year except the difference of 100. Again, some interesting parallels, and if I looked it up further, I might could even find some more. All right, with that, folk, I'll call it quits. I'll get out of here and think about, folk, at one time, the semester ended with the Civil War. We taught the first semester, but now we're going to teach the whole story. There's a lot more that could be said about the Civil War. All right, but now you all know the rules. I hope to have your grades posted, or if you need to leave, go ahead. But once the test starts, folk, if you leave, you have to ask you to turn in your test sheet. So if you think you're going to need to leave, get up and leave now. I'll let you back in. All right, in the class this morning, there were 39 questions. One of them, the grades were not all that good, but one of them answered 32 right. Another one answered 30 out of the 39. Another one answered 28. Most of them only got right 16 or 17. Now, generally, you students have done better than they do, but we'll see. All right.